Welcome to the Organizational Transformation Kung Fu Podcast with your hosts, Sandi and Jennifer Long.
Welcome to another episode of OT Kung Fu, Organizational Transformation Kung Fu. I'm here with my friend Jen Long, and we're going to talk today about how do you embed DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, into organizations rather than making it and taking it away from it being just a tick box or something that somebody has to do to satisfy some compliance or some something of that nature. So I'm here, as I said, with Jen Long. She's from Own Up in Colorado. Good morning, Jen.
Hello, Sandi from Satori Consulting in Ontario, Canada. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited about this one because we're doing a lot of strategy work these days. It tends to be the season, and diversity, equity, inclusion comes up all the time. And
it does. And I just want to point out that diversity and equity and inclusion is one of those things that companies are grappling with that really does need some transformational kung fu, because it's not a one and done. It's a discipline, right? It takes time and it takes practice. And I just want to put that out there because this is OT Kung Fu. This is really a topic that lands hard on that idea.
Yeah, it is. It's not a one and done, right? And everything that we sort of talk about through our podcast is how do you sort of embed, how do you transform organization and organizational cultures so that you're practicing things all the time. And so I guess from an OT Kung Fu standpoint, we're really excited about this particular topic. So DEI, it is a hot topic these days, right? Everybody's talking about it. And from my perspective, it seems to be a package deal. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Everybody's talking about it. And what do we do with it? We need to do something. We need to have a statement. We need to have a strategy. But I don't see people really looking at it from how do we change our organizations at the lens at which we look at things through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens or lens plural.
Right. Because there's so many opportunities, and I think that every organization needs to really define for themselves what their level of commitment is going to be and the business imperatives they want to impact, right? From the organizational standpoint, right? So there's always the, why do we want to do this, right? Yes, employee engagement and productivity. But in a time where it's really hard to bring people in, expanding your talent pool, right, is another good reason to want to invest the time and effort into the discipline of getting it done. From a teaming perspective, when you've got more diversity in the room, you get better decision making because you look through all the lenses, right? So there's all these things besides, being a better place to work, right? For people who want to be in an inclusive environment, right? The employment brand is a big organizational driver. So really kind of figuring out, all those things are good ideas, but what's the itch you really need to scratch other than maybe all of those, but a primary to get yourself started.
And right. So, but all of those things rolled up into it makes good business sense. And when things make good business sense, then organizations prosper, right? And so having people that feel included and having all these different pieces is again, good business sense. But I think we need to step back and start with organizations really need to look at not what their philosophy well, maybe what their philosophy is, but where are they now? Like, what is the benchmark? Where are you coming from? If you need to shift a dial, you need to really reflect on where you are today. And are you finding that your organizations are taking the time to reflect where they are?
I think maybe they're looking at sort of the basic metrics, and some metrics they're comfortable with and some metrics they're not comfortable with, right? And so the easy metrics are, what is our gender difference in how many we're hiring, what is our racial difference in what are we hiring, what are we promoting, right? That kind of thing. But I think they're probably less uncomfortable with maybe socioeconomic understanding. Um, I don't know, what are the other metrics that you're familiar with? Because I think denial of some of these is where it gets sticky.
Well, I think, and I think just looking at it from a gender diversity and looking at what does gender mean in our organizations today, right? And gender isn't just male, female. And are we open enough to reflect on that in terms of our hiring practices and our conversations that we're having, making people feel comfortable that reflect our communities? Because that's just a reality. Our communities are are not different today, but we're knowing about our communities, I think.
Well, exactly, and that's the obvious one. As I'm thinking that it's Pride Month as we record this, and it's a parade here in Denver today. Beautiful weather, and yeah, I mean that whole spectrum of gender and that whole notion has been around for a very very long time, and embracing some understanding around what that means. And I know that the difficulty starts to be common is when we're going to bring pronouns into the conversation. And um, we talked briefly about the some of the impact that these programs actually have had who haven't learned to embed it and stick with it in different ways and really do a little bit better discipline practice around it are actually finding it creates division, right? That instead of inclusivity, you've got people who are very aware and practicing and want to talk about pronouns and use pronouns and make that a part of the dialogue, are judging those who don't, and those who don't want to do or or are what is the big deal and are judging those who do it. So that we talked about this briefly, that when people when it foments judgment is when you've lost the plot, is when it in these efforts actually create more division than inclusion.
Yeah, yeah. I'm finding that a lot in strategic planning these days because, as you say, there's a continuum. There's people at all spots on the continuum around DEI, and those that have maybe those that are working in the space more or have just naturally gravitated to a deeper understanding. I do find that many times they are standing in judgment because they want the organization to shift rapidly to where they are. And many times organizations aren't there yet because they haven't done the due diligence internally to really define what it's going to mean for them and how do they live it, right? So we talked about embedding it. It's not a tick box. It's not just something that the HR manager is supposed to do, but it has to touch all aspects of the organization from top to bottom, bottom to top, and laterally.
Right, right. Or you end up with what's called tokenism, right? It's just these like shallow symbolic measures that really don't, I'm on a team because of my gender or color, and that's it. I'm not listened to any more in the room than I was before I was on the team.
Yes, yeah. And I get questioned about this a lot where people will say, do you mean I just have to hire that person because of X, Y, and Z? Because we need to say we have, enough of this, whatever this is, within our organization. And I don't think that is not what this is about. This is not about making sure that we have enough of whatever in an organization. It really is about skills based hiring. Looking at your pool differently and maybe sourcing it from a different areas and be
Right,
willing to entertain different people from different walks of life. And now I think it's even easier, if I could say that, in a talent deficit world. But because of the that we're all, many of us are still working remotely or hiring abroad more frequently, that you can look in different areas to hire, not just in your backyard.
well, yeah, and looking maybe a little more blindly, right? We've got really good analytics um, in a process. And so, really, what are you doing in your hiring process? What are you doing in your succession process? What are you doing in your like high potential process that creates some more agnostic approach out of the gate, um, to really promote a little bit more equity, right? In the sense of, because I think when you look at the bias spectrum, and there's so much, right? Name bias, age bias, like there's just, it's everywhere, all of the things that, if you're going to help people think more critically, right, about who they're bringing in, and I really liken good DEI embedding as a more critical lens on self-awareness, on how we're thinking about things, right, how we're putting processes together, what are the unintended consequences of how we've built this, right? How are we interviewing people? Who's in the room when we do an interview? Um, and what kind of due diligence are we doing at the front end to look more at capability, potential, fit before we start with name and where they live or where they're coming from, or what other triggers that our biases can play into.
Yeah. When we're doing hiring, we often will take the hiring committee and take them through some bias training, just so that they can hopefully identify it when it pops up, right? And hopefully they can, but it allows us to talk about it when I see it happening, right? It gives sort of that
Right.
permission to sort of call it out respectfully about what I'm seeing. And that's
Right.
been really super helpful.
And that's kind of the practice, right? And when we talk about the kung fu of this, it's not that you're suddenly going to not have the bias. These things they're unconscious for a reason, right? We don't know we do it when we do it, but somebody else could see it. And we have to be willing to be called out on and go, "Oh, you're right. I'm totally biased around this person has this kind of background because that's the background I have. It's a science engineering background, or it's a whatever it is." So that's when you look at the research of successful embedding, it's not just saying, here's some cognitive bias training or unconscious bias training. Like here, it's not, it's like, I liken it when I was first doing the research. I was like, oh, it's just like AA. You have to say, oh, I have unconscious bias. But then you've got to be able to do something about that,
Something
right?
with it,
It's like
absolutely.
emotional intelligence. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. So I think that's an important aspect. So when you're starting to thinking about how do we embed it into an organization, one of the first things, after you sort of understand where you are and benchmark and sort of determine your vision is, um, do we create a safe space to have conversations that might be difficult?
Right. Because I have to be able to, because the denial of it is at the issue, right? If you've got to get people out of the denial that, oh gosh, I am showing up this way. And to not make a person feel bad about that, to not make it shameful, um, that it occurs, because the sad fact is it occurs for everybody, regardless.
Exactly.
There,
Yeah, we all come with our own stuff.
everyone comes, right? And I think that being aware of, in the conversation, which gets down to communication skills and the right environment to set the right tone, is that you don't speak in tones of judgment. You don't speak in tones of shame. And are you aware of how that sounds? And that's what makes the conversation difficult, is immediately when somebody says, well, is that a bias? You might start to feel unsafe.
That's right. That's right. Unsafe, and or because you're now being judged in some way, you shut down. And the being able to have that conversation openly and freely is just that's a transformational culture in itself, right? Is to have that openness to be able to welcome those conversations. And I think that's part of the issue, is not the issue, the solving this is to have an environment where you welcome someone to say, have you thought about this? Or, it looks like you're doing this. I want to talk about it. Um, and being able to have openness.
Right. Openness and willingness, right? Willingness to call me on it when I do it, show me when I do it. And the other thing too is shaming others, judging others, but also yourself, right? There's an internal guilt that might show up for you, an internal shaming of, oh God, I can't believe, and oh my, I just can't open my mouth. And so that wanting to withdraw and not really engage with it as much as anybody making you feel like you're not safe, right? That's another whole piece of it.
Mhm. And so, what are you finding? Organizations that are sort of down this path a little bit further, what are you finding that they're doing that is helping embed this as opposed to making it a tick box exercise because there's a spotlight on it?
They've got continuous opportunities for learning and programmatic things that are happening within their culture. So aside from some kind of initial awareness training, which is always the first step, first we got to admit we're alcoholics. We all have unconscious bias, and we all need to know it impacts all of our decision making. So let's understand what that is. And I think putting that in a container that is understanding all the bias and heuristics that go into decision making in general, right? It's just good practice because not only does it help us from an inclusive and diverse perspective, but it also helps us, I mean, decision making overall in general, not just when it comes to people and putting people in jobs and hiring people and solving problems, but we just get to be better critical thinkers because we're aware of it anyway. So I think that kind of container for an initial approach around education is a good thing. Um, and then there are some organizations who are doing other programmatic things, right? Where they are exploring where is it happening and how is it happening? And let's talk about that. And let's look at the kind of actual circumstances that are showing up, right? This isn't the Hollywood version. This is what's happening in our enterprise. And how are we putting that out and sharing that in a way that allows people to have further discussion and understanding so that it's helpful, that they start to identify uh, the opportunities when it happens so they can see it when it happens. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's really DEI is a thing, right? And that we're all talking about it, but it's not any different than any other communication based strategy within an organization, right? Whether it's like as you're saying, whether it's decision making or the matrix that we're using to the frameworks that we're using to make change within an organization or change management, it all boils down to communication, sort of, and opening that an ability for people to safely talk about things. And so when you start doing and shifting that narrative, it's not about the thing, it's how we behave toward anything that we're trying to shift within an organization. And that's really what I think we need organizations to start thinking about. It's like, how do we shift? And not we're trying to move that thing. It's how do we shift an organization?
It's a big culture shift, right? It's like no other. It's just like any other culture shift is your culture is determined very much by the processes and systems you have in place and the behaviors that um, are a result of those processes and systems, right? Which is why we're looking at hiring and we're looking at succession. We're looking because those are processes and systems that are going to have things that are going to either add to your diversity and inclusion um, plan, or they're going to detract from that based on how it's structured and it's put to use. Because those things in the design, because you can't design culture, but you
Mm-hmm.
can design systems and processes. And
Right.
when you think about it in all of the systems thinking of uh, what does this intuitively tell us about how this is happening, but also what is the deliberate, methodical, analytical side of this, and what is that teaching us around the impacts of this process and system relative to these things? And so it's
Right.
adding a filter to your systems, going, how does this impact relative to this?
Mm-hmm. Right. But
And is
it's
it
not a
feeding it or
standalone.
helping?
right? It's not a standalone. Like that, you should be making all sorts of change and decisions through that sort of that lens, right? As opposed to this just being something that we need to do. And so I'm a little frustrated by this because I find that that's what organizations are trying to do right now. If we had a statement, then everybody would follow along. And it's not, it's bigger than that, right?
It is bigger than that. And the overcoming, especially in large organizations, because you can have pockets of it where they seem to have a better practice of it and pockets of it where it's just non-existent. Um, and weird resentment. And I think that um, there are, because it tends to focus on the external, that there's a resentment that it doesn't include cognitive uh, diversity, and it feels like it doesn't include experience diversity when it should, right? So because it's easy to talk about gender and race and age and all that kind of stuff, things that we can visual diversity as opposed to the things that are non-visible. Um, and that's where more critical thinking around and having the conversation and the willingness, right? Because if there's resentment there, you've got to deal with that first. If there's denial there, you've got to deal with that first. And if you're not going to talk about the fact that we're in denial, you're not even going to get to getting it outside of a tick box because this is what somebody said we were going to go do.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, sort of takeaways for organizations and right now would be, I think, to start looking at have that critical lens on how we are making decisions around DEI, how we're bringing it forward to our staff, how we are um, how we're engaging them in the process of how do we embed it deeper into our organization. So it's not owned by somebody over here; it's organizationally owned, right? Changing the dialogue that we're having around it as we're changing and moving forward.
Right. If you divide your organization up into its pie chart of parts, right, and you look at it in your sense of, your business finance or your operations or your human resources or your product development or whatever it is, what are the systems and processes within each of those areas of the business, right? And I was interested in just very simple things like performance review and how performance review systems in and of themselves create equity issues because women statistically review themselves, right? The self review. Women are typically harder on themselves and more critical of themselves. And men don't typically give women meaningful feedback in relative to what they would need. And so there's this kind of built in thing anyway. And so recognizing that self assessments and performance review may be something that touches all the places in your organization. And what are you doing to change that system to make that more equitable in terms of the kind of feedback everybody gets? Yeah. So I mean, here's the thing is there's no one answer for every organization. There's no right way necessarily. What I would say is what you ought to take away is what are you willing to experiment with and how are you going to measure that experiment? Because if you're a dispersed remote based organization, what kind of online, right, learning opportunities, conversations, forums are you going to put together? I was reading about one organization who created a podcast where people who were in the conversation were recorded, right? Like, here's what we're talking about. And so they could hear people having the conversation who were in a safe place, who were willing, who were open. And so that might be an interesting way to start because then you can see what a safe conversation sounds like. And you can participate in that conversation through a threaded conversation, right? Like we do on our podcast. We put things under the video and engage in, and what does that conversation spark and how might that change the next podcast? And those kind of internal mechanisms, I think, are helpful in addition to just the fundamentals of people understanding how they think. And looking at your systems and designing with intention. That's what I got.
Yeah, I think yeah, it's organizations really sort of need to take it away and look at it from their perspective. I think what you just said was absolutely right. You can't take what one organization is doing and saying, well, this is what we're going to do, because each organization is organically different and made up of different people and systems and structures. So define your own, define what it means for your organization in for you and not to satisfy something else. And then start looking at it through those critical lenses to have those conversations and start building out something that is sustainable and is improving your business model rather than creating any kind of fractures within your organization or um, judgment where people can send a judgment because they don't understand.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know organizations are investing in, and I'm not sure what the EEO role versus a diversity person, right? It feels like there's an evolving, we're changing the title to recognize it as a position that is our diversity and inclusion champion, that really is the spearhead person who is going to resource these efforts, who is going to create this, because it's an interesting cooperation of having this leadership support, but also most of the design and ideas should really be built bottom up,
Yeah,
because it is the
grassroots.
voices of your organization that you're interested in to begin with. And so that's a interesting challenge in and of itself.
For sure. So all of the sort of change management principles that go into any sort of change, design change, I think apply here. And organizations sure probably just need to step back a little bit. The ones that are struggling with it. And like with any good change agent, you're going to have somebody who's championing it. And so maybe that's where people need to start, is somebody who will take a critical lens and own it, whatever it looks
Yeah.
like for that organization. Start
And
defining it.
and don't get overly reliant on the consultants, right? There's a lot of consultants out there who are bringing things in, and I'm sure there's a lot of them who are really good, but I'm sure there's a lot of them who are just like, yeah, let's bank a buck on this effort, right? And because it's very much internal, be judicious for how long you've got somebody in there and what ideas they're bringing and where you are with those. Think critically about those as well. Because I think if you're going to embed, you got to own it at a level that a consultant can never do.
Absolutely, absolutely. And starting, we talked about bias initially. What biases are their consultants bringing in when they don't really, really understand your culture? Are they bringing in sort of biases that may hinder the success of your shift?
Right. Right. Be aware of the consultant bias.
It can happen. It can happen.
Yes,
For
it
sure.
happens. It's a thing.
It is a thing.
Well, hopefully that helps give you a little bit more ammo around how you might attack it, think about it, and hold the discipline, and to remember that it's a practice. It's a practice. It's not a thing. It's not a program. It's not a policy. It's a practice, and it becomes very much who you are and how you are and how you think, and really starting with that self-examination, and then that willingness to share together, to build together, to shift together. And so it is transformational, and it is kung fu.
It is, and we would love to hear from you if you're either struggling in your organization or you've done great things in making your shift. We'd love to hear from you as to what's working, so that we
Yeah,
can
some success
share that.
stories.
Yeah,
Yeah, because there's certainly information out there about what's not working and what's not happening and what is struggling. But because it's a longer term proposition, if you've been in it for a while and you've got some success to share, how you did it, what you did to seed ideas for other people would be helpful. Let's be inclusive. All right, very good. So one of the practices we're
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 going to
gonna keep
shift.
talking. So if this is the end of what your commute was and you want to listen to another episode, this might be where we cut it in half and we'll start our next episode. But one of the practices that diversity inclusion really speaks to is psychological safety. And so now we're gonna dive in a little bit deeper into psychological safety, the practice of psychological safety, and how that can impact so many things in your organization.
Thank you so much for listening. You can check out Sandi's website at satoriconsultinginc.ca. That's SATORI consultinginc.ca, and visit Jen's website at own-up.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.